I really appreciated you guys just coming, and these messages that I've been bringing were kind of brought forward as a result of trying to just reflect on what is it that God really wants us to do outside of, on the other side of this COVID pandemic. We've had a year and a half of really becoming adjusted to a new normal, and no one really knows how all this is going to pan itself out. So we're just trying to be consistent with what the scriptures are teaching so that we can walk, with a certain amount of certainty and assurance as we look to the future. So when we started doing that, I've had a couple of books. One was by N.T. Wright on God in the pandemic. It just reminded us again that the greatest sign that God has given us is His Son. We don't need any other sign than that. In Him, we know how all this is going to come to an end. We also have all the assurances of life and His presence and His power. So there was another book by Will Mancini on future church, and he began to look at some of these fundamental things that the church needs to revisit. And it's always hard, right? Like you get used to a certain way of doing things, and then stuff happens, and it just changes everything. And you find yourself in a little bit of a quandary because you're trying to get some traction, and you just don't really know where to begin. There is a video that I found that I think you guys are going to really enjoy. And it's called Embrace the Shake. And it's pretty self-explanatory. And I hope you guys really appreciate it.
So when I was in art school, I developed a shake in my hand, and this was the straightest line I could draw. Now, in hindsight, it was actually good for some things like mixing a can of paint or shaking a Polaroid. But at the time, this was really doomsday. This was the destruction of my dream of becoming an artist. The shake developed out of really a single-minded pursuit of pointillism, just years of making tiny, tiny dots. And eventually, these dots went from being perfectly round to looking more like tadpoles because of the shake. So to compensate, I'd hold the pen tighter, and this progressively made the shake worse, so I'd hold the pen tighter still. And this became a vicious cycle that ended up causing so much pain and joint issues, I had trouble holding anything. And after spending all my life wanting to do art, I left art school, and then I left art completely. But after a few years, I just couldn't stay away from art, and I decided to go to a neurologist about the shake and discovered I had permanent nerve damage. And he actually took one look at my squiggly line and said, well, why don't you just embrace the shake? So I did. I went home, I grabbed a pencil, and I just started letting my hand shake and shake. I was making all these scribble pictures. And even though it wasn't the kind of art that I was ultimately passionate about, it felt great. And more importantly, once I embraced the shake, I realized I could still make art. I just had to find a different approach to making the art that I wanted. Now, I still enjoyed the fragmentation of pointillism, seeing these little tiny dots come together to make this unified whole. So I began experimenting with other ways to fragment images where the shake wouldn't affect the work, like dipping my feet in paint and walking on a canvas. Or in a 3D structure consisting of 2x4s, creating a 2D image by burning it with a blowtorch. I discovered that if I worked in a larger scale and with bigger materials, my hand really wouldn't hurt. And after having gone from a single approach to art, I ended up having an approach to creativity that completely changed my artistic horizons. This was the first time I'd encountered this idea that embracing a limitation could actually drive creativity.
Enhance creativity. Is that how you think about the new normal we're experiencing right now? Because, see, we could lament and go back and wish everything stayed exactly the way it was, but everything has changed. And I really don't think it's going to go back on a number of levels. Number one, a lot of people discovered on demand. And now, I can tell you, they got kind of used to having pancakes and turning on their television and gathering together as a family and watching a service online. Now, we can argue about, well, that's not how it should be done, but it's not up to us, right? It's going to be up to how people are beginning to embrace this new kind of normal. And no one can really speak with a whole lot of assurance and confidence. We're just going to have to kind of go along for a little while and see how this is going. So for me, and like for Steve, you're doing things online and you're doing things in person. But here's the thing. One of the things that I felt has really been exposed because of this COVID experience is something that I shared with your elders the other day when we had a little bit of a breakfast meeting. And I talked to them a little bit about how a lot of churches, when you think about the way in which we are organized, most of your money was for those was spent in the weekend experience. So everything was built around the gathering of people that coming together. So it had everything to do with the place. It had everything to do with the personality of the leaders. So if someone had a certain life group and I kind of connected with them, then I felt like this was really good. If I like Steve, it seems like he's on point, he's really delivering good messages, then I'm feeling good about this. Or about programs. I like the fact that there are hiking groups. I like the fact that there's this knitting group. I like the fact that, we're doing a couple of things with the community. And all of that endears me a little bit more to the people. And so I feel like, well, church is doing great. But what do you think about that for a moment? Because the church then became defined a little bit by these 4 Ps. The church became more, in terms of whether we were doing a good job or not doing a good job, based on how these 4 things were really going on. People liked the leaders, if they really liked the programs, if they felt good about their place, where they were supporting it, not only with their time and their treasure, right? Then COVID happens. And there is no place. And there are no programs. And the people now are being sequestered at home, And the personality is hard to convey over a little screen, and there's not much interaction. And so what happens? That people continue on with fervor in their love for Jesus? Or did all of a sudden other things begin to fall into place? And then, for some, they took the posture that, well, the government is against us and they're keeping us from serving God. What do you think about that for a moment? Remember the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman? He sits there and he talks to her. And after he mentions the fact that she's had 5 husbands and she's living with a guy that's not her husband now, she kind of changes the subject. And she says, you Jews say that we should be worshiping in Jerusalem. But we believe that we ought to be worshiping in Mount Gerizim. And Jesus kind of cuts her off and he says, I tell you the truth, neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship. For our Father is seeking those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. So, locality, geography, had nothing to do with whether or not you can worship God. It had everything to do with the condition of a person's heart. And so consequently, it began to show that maybe for a lot of people who were enthralled with the place, the personalities, the programs, the people, the minute some of those things went away, then what did that say about really the way in which they were approaching their faith? Was it growing? Was roots put down deeply? Was there this sense of fervor? Was it pushing us to maintain this mission that we've been talking about? Because the mission didn't go away just because circumstances happened that closed our buildings for a period of time. The mission was always to make sure that we're loving God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. Motivated by that, God says, I want you to go out into the world and make disciples. And I think probably at Sisters, and I know for us, back home, and for a lot of my friends who are pastoring churches, they kind of made a pivot and started finding ways in which they can ingratiate themselves with the community at large. So, for instance, there were a number of people in our church who began to take an inventory of our senior population and they made regular calls. I made it a point to say, I want everyone who is on our rolls to receive a phone call, at least one call every week. And that was a lot of names. That was thousands of names. And so it became very obvious that I couldn't just do that by myself. And, we have a staff of maybe about 30, 33. There's no way they're going to be able to do all that. So we started going around, and we would look at people like Brian. We look at people like John, Dean, and I don't know many of you ladies by name yet, but we would find people who seemed to show some sense of maturity, and they were willing, and so we gave them like 10 names. And you know what happened out of those calling week and week and week? All of a sudden, the people that were worshiping with them Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, they all of a sudden got to know those 10 people a lot better. And then they all of a sudden realized that there were some needs that needed to be addressed. Doctor's appointments, physical therapy appointments that you could only drop somebody off and you couldn't go inside with them. And some people were having a hard time now just maneuvering. How do you get online? How do we avail ourselves of being able to order food online? And so the youth group got together, and they had this little brigade, and they would go around to all the senior homes and say, okay, this is how you turn on your computer. This is how you can navigate to this place. And now some of those seniors, they're like Facebook ninjas. Seriously, they know more stuff about what's going on than I do, and they're on there, boy. And you know what else also happened? Like people, they also learned how to give online, do banking online. I have there's a woman in our church who's responsible for Citizens Bank, for the whole state of New Hampshire. And she said that people who are now banking online, it has exponentially gone through the roof. And so now she's started to think about how are they going to scale back in-person employees because there's not that big of a demand like there used to be. And she also said that a lot of the women who have had to juggle work and kids and schedules and sports and all those things, because it usually fell on them, they were falling more and more out of the workplace. So now coming out of the pandemic, some of those ladies were not returning because they thought, hey, you know what? I think I could work a little less, and I'm getting a lot of satisfaction of doing some of these other things. So she is now like scrambling around. So like on the one hand, really positive, everything online. On the other hand, she's got like some challenges on the HR front. But you know what that meant for us as a church? People registered online. So that meant whether they were at church or they weren't at church, they were pretty regular in their giving. When I came to Bethany, we had about $4 million in debt because they built this huge building. Pastor got in a little bit of trouble. He left. And we weathered through 9/11 because the church was, they celebrated their first Easter in Easter of 2000. So in 2001, 9/11 happened. The pilot that struck the second tower was a member of our church. His name was Tom McGinnis. And so that immediately not only made 9/11 a national emergency, it made it a very personal one. And so he had 2 children. The whole church gathered around them. And so that was 3 days after the pastor had to resign because of moral failure. So September the 8th, he comes back from a sabbatical to be disclosed, or exposed, really. And then 3 days later, 9/11 happens, and I think in the providence of God, that happened the way it did because it made this news non-news comparison to everything that was going on. But now, how do you keep this momentum moving forward after they just built all these brand new facilities? You know what? During COVID, we have been opening up a number of campuses because the average church in New England is about 37 people. So they're closing left and right. As congregations get older and older. So for instance, here we had a pastor from a church in Kittery Point, Maine, beautiful, just right on the other side of the river, gave me a call. Their congregation had dwindled down to 4 people. And they had this beautiful building, needed some work, but I mean, the timber in that building, like those beams were like huge. I mean, it wasn't going anywhere. But because of the lack of resources and people, they just could not continue. So I did a database search on where our members were, and we had 147 families that lived within a 5-mile radius of Kittery Point. And they would travel from Kittery and come all the way down to Greenland, where our main campus is. So I proposed that to the congregation, and I said to them, look, we're not going to do anything unless we can pay for it. So if God has given us a vision to do something, then I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we have skin in the game, that we're going to do this. So I had an old retired general that was on my board, and he says, Pastor, that's really good. He says, but I think that we should go a step further. And I said, what's that? He says, I think what we should do is say that we're not going to let out any contracts until the money is in the bank, in escrow. Think about that for a minute. You could have pledges from people, and you could begin to kind of figure out, okay, there's going to be a seasonality to how these pledges come in. How are you going to do that in a project timeline of getting construction done? And so I said, I think I want to just pray about this. So I went back, and we got together a bunch of guys, and we prayed for a couple of days, and then we came back to our next meeting. And he said, so what do you think, Pastor? And I go, you know what? I've been telling everybody that we're not going to do something here unless God opens the door and people are willing to do it. So I don't see any problem. So we'll do that. And you know what? We paid for that building in cash and re-outfitted that entire building. We invested $1.2 million in this building, took it to the very studs on the outside, put in new insulation, new plumbing. I had a guy in our congregation who was a master plumber for some of the huge high-rises down in Boston. And I did a funeral for his son who died from a drug overdose. And he started coming to the church because of that. And about 5 months later, we're sitting around having a discussion. And so he gives me a call and he says, Pastor, I'll tell you what. He says, I'll do all the plumbing in the church. You guys just buy the material. Think about that, right? Like, how does that happen? I mean, that's like a total God thing. So why am I saying all this stuff to you? Because, see, all of this stuff is going on in this mix where the church is growing. In COVID, now you're thinking, oh my gosh, we have debt on our main campuses. We don't have them on our other campuses because we made a decision. We're going to pay as we go. Well, during COVID, because people have been faithful in giving online, we paid off all our debt. I don't owe anybody anything. We're in such a great position right now for this, whatever the future is going to hold. And I thought, okay, how did all of that come to be? Because you have to make some kind of changes. And it dawned on me, like, you have to embrace the shake. Okay, this is a limitation right now. COVID has placed some limitations on us, but it could have very well opened up vast avenues of opportunity. And that's not just a salesman talking. I really believe that, right? If God, how many times have you guys heard the expression, right? God closes this door, but he opens that door. And I'm sure your lives could be testimony to that. So what this did, though, is it showed that sometimes maybe we were focusing or putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable, right? That it's not that these things are bad. It's what gets people to start coming and attending. But that's not what God called the church to do in and of itself. It's not just to create environments. He was asking us to make disciples. And you begin to see that maybe the strength of people's faith was not as vibrant as it could have been because they paid too much attention on the lower room stuff. So I want to talk to you a little bit more. And part of this, as I said, I shared with your elders the other day, is that imagine you're going on this journey and you have 4 passengers. One of them is vision, and another one is relationship, and then you have management, and then you have, programs. They all pile in the car. Vision is the one that's driving. Relationship says, look, I'll keep you company up in the front. Management and programs, they sit in the back. And they're going, and they're beginning to forge their way. They're making headway. Vision gets a little tired. Relationship says, I think maybe we'll take a seat in the back. And so they change seats. And so now vision and relationship are in the back seat, and management or programs are driving. Only where are they going now? It has everything to do with just maintaining what you already have. It's about making sure that you're maximizing those programs. You're doing everything you can to make sure that those 4 Ps are really, firing on all cylinders. But is that the vision for which God called His church? I thought it was supposed to be about making disciples, and I thought it was about getting this word in people's lives so that it would demonstrate a power not unlike any other power that's able to bring about this transformation. Because we don't need better strategies, we need a Savior. Right? We just don't need better counseling, we need a Christ, right? We need the Messiah. And so I think then, as we look at that, this blue funnel that represents maybe those 4 Ps, it's time for us to then begin to get a grander vision for what God's going to do in terms of the multiplication of disciples. Because at the end of the day, He's going to ask His church, what did you do? Just like when we started this back on Monday with that passage from Joshua. When Joshua was giving out all the land, and then all of a sudden Manasseh and Ephraim, 2 of the tribes come and they said, hey, we don't have enough land. And he says, you got the largest share, but you got to go clear the land and you got to take the land. And they weren't willing to personally sacrifice, and they certainly weren't willing to live by faith. And so consequently, they wanted Joshua to fix their problem. Maybe the anemic condition of the church in which we're experiencing in our days is because we've lost sight a little bit of the grander vision. What it is that God has really called us to. And it can't just be the blue funnel. It can't just be about people, programs, personalities, and place. While all those things are great, honestly, having a nice place that has resources to turn on lights and put on air conditioning and have slides, and that's helping us along the way. But that's not the only reason. We have to use all this stuff then to fulfill the greater mission, which is to go and make disciples of all the nations, teaching them to obey whatsoever things I've commanded you. And so we said, well, that's going to happen through the power of the Word, and it's also going to happen as a result of unity that's being expressed, and it's also going to happen because you and I have made a commitment to grow. We said that we are going to, it says, no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but we're going to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. That one simple commitment means that I'm engaged, because now I'm doing that personal examination. I'm saying, okay, God, how can I grow closer to you? Because it's not saying that we are that we're not being conformed to the world. It says, don't be conformed any longer. And so that kind of personal reflection is one in which you begin to say to yourself, all right, am I doing things that really please God? Do I even know what it is that really pleases God? And if I'm not careful, I just revert back to those 4 Ps, and I think, hey, we're all good. No, we're not really all good. Because then that's what Jesus had problems with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. He goes, you guys, you travel all over to make one convert, and then when you make him twice the son of hell as you are. Whoa. Or when Jesus is teaching his disciples and they're going along the fields and they start to eat grain, and what do the Pharisees and everybody else do? They start complaining because, your disciples are eating with unwashed hands. And Jesus kind of hits the pause button and says, is it what goes into a man that defiles him, or is it what comes out of his heart that defiles him? And then you realize that Jesus is not playing around. He wants us to deal with the stuff that's in our life, not to condemn us, but to just say, come on, we could do better. So I think then, in the papers that you have, I'd like to read the story of the sower and the seed, and maybe make a couple of applications of the story that we normally don't do when we read this story. So in your papers, I printed out the whole story, but I want you to realize that when you start reading through the Gospel of Matthew, you begin to realize that there is growing opposition to Jesus. That it's becoming more and more vocal, and you can begin to sense that not everybody is happy with what Jesus is doing. And he begins, if you look in chapter 12, there is, people, they brought him a demon-possessed man. Jesus heals him. People are accusing him of being in cahoots with the devil, right? They don't really understand what Jesus is doing. Catch this at the end of chapter 12 in verse 46. It says, while Jesus was still talking to the crowd, his mother and brothers stood outside waiting to speak to him. Someone told him, your mother and brothers are standing outside waiting to speak to you. And he said, who is my mother and who are my brothers? Pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Wow. Sometimes Jesus says things, and you got to just stop for a moment, because that was kind of caustic, right? On one level. But on the other level, Jesus is trying to bring a point here, saying that here is the Messiah who has come to give us a glimpse of what this kingdom of heaven is all about, what the secrets of the kingdom now are beginning to unfold in not only in his teaching, but in his miracles. And what we find is more and more hostility towards what Jesus is saying. And so now, at the end of chapter 12, you realize there is this tension that is beginning to fester, even with his own brothers. This story is told again in the Gospels of Luke and Mark. And what they say in that text is that the brothers, they start thinking that Jesus is crazy. Which is interesting to me, because after Jesus resurrects from the dead, if you look in chapter 15, it says that Jesus appeared to the 12, and then he appeared to Peter, and then at the very end it says he appeared to James. That was one of his brothers that thought he was crazy. And James, he would become the chief elder in the church in Jerusalem. Talk about a tough job. And he weathered that storm, and that church grew. So something happened in this life of James that brought them all around. But you can see in this one period of time, there's this tension that is brewing. So what does Jesus do? Chapter 13 are parables that Jesus now shares about this kingdom of heaven that is upon them. And he tells them stories so that they get a sense of what's going on. So listen, it says, that same day, right? The same day where all this tension is existing, it says that same day Jesus went out of the house, sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it. And while all the people stood on the shore. And then he told them many things in parables. So you get this scene. He's in this house with his disciples, right? That basically he's saying, these are my family. And everyone who does the will of my Father is my brother and sister. So what's the qualification of being one of his brothers and sisters? Say that? Obedience, right? Is it perfection? Because isn't part of the obedience, it says if you sin, you ask for forgiveness, right? This is never a call to being perfect. This is just recognizing that I need God in my life. And what he's saying is the sons and daughters, the citizens of heaven, are those who now are embracing the will of the Father. So how are you going to live your whole life in rebellion against the things of God and then have this quiet assurance that you are a child of God? Now, I believe once saved, always saved. All I'm saying is that what does that really look like in the overview of a person's whole life? So let's read the parable. It says, a farmer went out to sow his seed. And as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. You might see here, right? So I put down. All right, I'm just going to read the story. It says, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still others fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 160, 30 times what was sown. He who has ears, let him hear. Who's he speaking this to? He got into a boat. Who's he addressing? The crowds. So if you're thinking of a funnel, right, it's the widest part of the funnel. He's talking to everybody. And then he adds, to him who has ears, let him hear. So the disciples come to him and ask, why do you speak to the people in parables? And notice what Jesus says. He says, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. So can I just pause for a moment? They want to know why Jesus is speaking in these parables. And Jesus says, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you. So what does that say then about the seed that he is sowing? The seed that Jesus is sharing, you're going to see that he's going to give an interpretation, and it's about the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. You want to know what heaven is like? Then listen to what Jesus is saying. But he says, this knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. That's why I speak to them in parables. And then he quotes, from Isaiah, though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They can hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. Jesus is quoting words from Isaiah. What's going on in the period of time when Isaiah writes these words? I'm sure some of you guys, you know the answer to this. What's the condition in Israel during this time of Isaiah? They are about to be led into captivity. In fact, Isaiah is writing at a time when the northern kingdom, because at that time Israel was divided into two, right? So you had the northern kingdom and you had the southern kingdom. Northern kingdom was known as what? Israel. Southern kingdom was known as Judah. So now you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was known as Israel, and so the Assyrians were going to come down, and eventually they're going to wipe them off the map. And Isaiah is telling them over and over again that because they held to a form of religion and had really nothing to do with the power of that religion, they were giving God lip service all the time. And he's saying, you guys have eyes, but you don't see. You have ears, but you're not listening. And the reason is because they have hardened their hearts towards the things of God. And as a result of a hard heart towards God, then are you going to receive anything? Are you going to hear anything? Are you open to being instructed? Are you going to be amenable to changing your ways? You're going to keep on doing what you've always done. Sometimes that could be the people, place, personalities, and programs. I go to temple. I offer my sacrifices. I give in a little bit of extra money. I do all that stuff. Hey, I'm a good Jew. No, you're not, because you're not listening. You're not seeing. You're not engaged. Isaiah told them that, warning them, not only of the northern invasion, but Isaiah is an interesting book because he also foresees 150 years later when Babylon is going to come and destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple, and the people are going to be carried off into exile. Isaiah is speaking about things that are yet to happen, but with such a clarity that nobody can miss it. Unless you don't have eyes to see and ears to hear, and your hearts have become hardened. You see, that's why I said it goes back to chapter 12. Because chapter 12 is now building up all this hostility, how people are pushing Jesus out into the margins. They're not really listening. So when he begins to tell them the story, giving them the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, the crowd just isn't getting it. And now they're saying, well, why are you doing that? He says, because to you it's been given this opportunity because your eyes are open. He goes, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. Now, we both know these disciples, they weren't perfect. Far from it. They're going to mess up many times, right, in the course of this book. Peter's going to deny Jesus 3 times. I think we need to be a little bit more grace-filled when it comes to other believers here, right? But you never stop chasing after it. It's like I heard this one black preacher say, you may not be holy, but you best be chasing after it. And that's the truth. So Jesus says, your eyes and ears are blessed because... it's all right. It says, I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous men long to see what you see, but do not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. So there is a distinction then to the disposition of the person now who is being confronted with the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. That's everybody, all of us now. We need to ask that question on an individual basis. How open am I really to being instructed by Jesus? Because he gave the parable to the crowds, understanding that, a lot of them just aren't listening. So then he brings the disciples to the side and he says, listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom, so see, this is why I said to you, here, the seed then, this seed is about the message of the kingdom of heaven. That God has taken, so his words now, the things that he's teaching them, it's as if he says, look, I am now taking the seed and I am throwing it out. And remember I said it was about the disposition of the person that was receiving it. Well, now notice what it says in your text. It says, when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. I want you to pay attention to how the various soils are interacting in this parable. So, they're not doing anything with it, but the evil one sure is doing something with it. He's snatching it away before it has any time to germinate in anybody's life. This is the seed sown along the path. The one who received the seed that fell on the rocky places, right? So that's the path. Now you have the seed that falls on the rocky places. So you can throw this in your notes just so that you guys remember, because we're going to go back to this in a moment. This is the seed, so the one who received the seed. So this way, this ground, it was open, right? It received this seed. And notice what it says. They received the seed that fell on rocky places is the man who hears the word. Do you notice they hear it? But they don't really hear it. Because it says, at once they receive it with joy. But since he has no root, he lasts only a short time. And why is that? Because the rocky soil is representative of this. He says, when trouble or persecution comes, what does those next 4 words say? Because of the word. Do you understand that when trouble and persecution comes because of the word, it means that I'm having this internal struggle with what the secrets of the kingdom of heaven are teaching me. In other words, I don't like what I'm hearing. Now, what are you going to do with that? Isn't that a place where all of us, at one time or another, we find ourselves? Even when you're walking with the Lord a long time, you sometimes don't you feel like a little exasperated with yourself, where you sit there and you go, I should know better. Only this person, it's taken it to a whole nother level. And as soon as any kind of trouble or persecution happens because of the word, they're not trying to improve. They just give it up. He says he quickly falls away. Isn't it interesting? He hears the word, receives it with joy. I love all those promises about life. I love all those promises about forgiveness. But yeah, you're calling me to pursue holiness? You're asking me to engage in your mission? Yeah, I don't think so. I'd lose too many friends if I did that. It says, then the one who received the seed that fell among the thorns, right? So you have the thorn bushes here, right? He says, is the man who, again, he hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke it. I just want you to notice what it is that is actually doing the choking of the seed. It could be worries. It could be wealth. Pick your poison. Both are going to have the same effect. It's going to keep the plant from being productive, making it what? Unfruitful. But the one who received the seed that fell on the good soil is the man who hears the word and understands it and produces a crop yielding 100, 60, 30 times what was sown. One commentator told me that a good harvest in the period of this Rome was about 7 to 10 times. That was a once in a lifetime. Jesus is talking about 30, 60, 100-fold. Only God could do that. So let me summarize this then with you. The type of the soil has everything to do with the disposition of the person's heart, right? Because now he has been talking to this crowd. The disciples want to know, hey, why are you speaking to them in parables? And Jesus says, well, you're the ones that are hungry to know, and so I'm going to tell you, but their hearts are callous. They really don't want to know. So it's not that he's not making the information available. It's just the environment in which that seed is sown is going to have everything to do with the harvest that is produced. Are we following each other? So the one on the path, the birds swoop down, take away the seed. They hear the word, don't understand it. The devil steals it away. The rocky ground, there's no depth of earth. There's instant growth, but it's just for a season. It has no root, and therefore it's scorched by the sun. And the sun, he says here, it's this initial reception of the gospel message, but persecution leads to falling away. It gets a little uncomfortable. Thanks, but no thanks. I'll get back to you. One that falls on the weeds, right? It says the seed grew among thorns that choked it. The reception of the word was compromised by riches or by worldly concern. Every single one of those plants turned out to be unfruitful. What did Jesus say on this very day when he was telling that parable? He said, I'll tell you who my brothers and sisters and mother are. They're the ones who do the will of my Father who is in heaven. So see, that's why I think that these seeds right here, they're not indicative of different types of Christians. I don't believe that they're Christians at all. Because you could be a Christian where the seed falls in good soil, and you could still be like Peter and the rest of those disciples that have to learn and mature and grow. That's not the issue. We're not talking about perfection. We're talking about an openness to being instructed, the disposition of a heart that says, I want to fix my eyes on Jesus, and I want to run this race of faith. But not for the one that fell on the path, not the one that fell on the rocky soil, not for those on the weeds. It's only the tilled ground. Seed took root, and there it began to grow. The word was heard, understood, received. Spiritual life, right? Spiritual fruit in this human life that we're living. And like anybody who understands something about plants that are growing, it grows in stages. It grows into maturity. So here's a couple of lessons that I just want you to take away, and then we'll put it all together. You do realize that only one environment out of 4 bore any fruit. So that should tell you right off the bat that not all of our gospel labor is going to have a positive effect. That's just the truth. I don't like that. But that's what Jesus is saying. He says, so think about it. If you go out and you're sharing this gospel, you're trying to engage in this mission of God, I don't want to set you up for failure. Like what I'm saying is, you're going to realize that, hey, if Jesus is the one that's out there doing the sowing, and only one out of the 4 environments produce any kind of harvest, then what is that saying to you and me? But if you heard Jesus, he says, this is so that prophecy may be fulfilled. God knows the end from the beginning. Nothing is going to catch you by surprise. You know what I tell people? The one thing you will never hear God say, oops, never. Because God doesn't make a mistake. He knows the end from the beginning. The second thing here I want you to see is that the effectiveness of our gospel witness, it may not be immediately apparent. So think about the way in which you lay hands on leaders in your church. Doesn't even Timothy say, don't do it to a young believer? You start giving away too much information, too much authority and responsibility here. It may not serve them well. Don't count people out too quickly. You just got to give them a little time for them to grow. They'll show what they're made out of. That one seed that you thought, well, oh man, look at that thing, it's growing so quick. As soon as the thing go their way, they're done. You guys have been alive long enough, can't you see that in friends and people around you? At one point, they received the word with gladness. And where are they now? But I still don't count them out. For me, it's not over until it's over. That thief on the cross, in his final moments, Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. Now, his life was anything but stellar, right? That guy's crucified for crimes that he committed. But God is willing to give him this shower of grace and welcome even the likes of him. But your life could have been a lot better if he had known Jesus sooner. Here's another thing. Opposition is to be expected. When the seed fell on the hard ground, wasn't the evil one the first one to come and take it? It should give you this indication that there is, living in this world, there is this tension. There's always going to be this battle that is taking place. Ephesians says that we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and dominions. But Ephesians also says in the first chapter that all rulers, authorities, powers, dominions have been placed under Jesus' feet. So therefore, stand firm in the knowledge of God's strength. Put on the full armor of God so that you can stand against the devil's schemes. But I think Jesus is telling everybody who has ears to hear, expect opposition, because that's how it's like in this world. He's going to go on to tell them about the weed and the weeds, the weeds and the wheat, and how they grow up side by side until the end of the harvest. The last thing I want you to see here is that there are different ways in which the gospel of the kingdom can be rendered ineffective. People could have false assumptions about what life in this world is going to be about. They work really hard to make this life heaven. This life is never going to be heaven. Never. I had lunch today with a couple of individuals. One was an old-time pastor here, right, Steve? He's in his middle 80s now. And then another fellow named John Vaughter. Guys have been in ministry for a very, very, very long time. And we sat around the table talking about, it was like an organ recital. What's wrong with this friend and what's wrong with that friend. But in the midst of all that, they all talked about a testimony of friends who were standing strong to the end and who have not given up on this hope. And they were engaged in writing, and they were engaged in giving back to younger pastors right now. And I walk away with Steve, and I think, yeah, you're not done. You're not done until God calls you home. But I look at this text, and I think, yeah, if I have a false assumption that this world is going to be heaven, and then it doesn't turn out to be that way, isn't that like the seed that fell on the rocky soil? It had no roots, so the minute anything went sideways, it just gave it up. We can't have Christians like that. Look at Jesus. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising its shame. Tells us to run the race of faith with great endurance. That in your weakness, his strength is made sufficient. That there is nothing that has befallen you except that which is common to man. And God is faithful and will not allow you to be tried beyond what you're able to bear. But with every trial, there's a way of escape. Like all these passages, aren't they telling us? It says, consider it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the trying of your faith produces perseverance, and perseverance, maturity, proven character, so that you'd be complete and not lacking anything. And if any of you lacks anything, let him ask of God, who gives to all men freely. See, this last one here is really, really true. We ought to camp out on that one for a moment, because there's a lot of ways in which the gospel of the kingdom can be rendered ineffective. And one of them could be from false assumptions. Another one can be from over-exercised, worry and anxiety. And another one could be the deceitfulness of riches that thinks, hey, I'm good. Thanks. Life is sweet. I got what I need. Really? Really. Because all you need is a couple of events in your life, and all of a sudden, what you were banking on, it doesn't seem like very much anymore. You'd give it all away. So, this parable then had everything to do with us taking a look and getting the grander vision of what God is accomplishing here. Something really bigger. And looking at limitation as an opportunity to be that much more creative. Because you see, what God is ultimately asking you and me to do is he says, I don't want you to live your Christian life in this lower room. I want you to take the stairs and I want you to go up to the upper room. I want you to live with a sense of mission. I want you to live out these kingdom values in the world in which we're living. I want you to strategize together in ways that you can reach those all around you with this gospel, understanding that not everybody's going to get it, that there's going to be all kinds of opposition that's going to come up against you, that there's going to be 1,001 ways that's going to seek to render this ineffective. But for that one person where it does happen, 30, 60, 100-fold, which says to you and me that God doesn't need all of that. What he needs is a few faithful servants that he could reproduce himself through them. Think about it. Jesus said this to 12 disciples who went to 70 disciples that he sent out, that went to 120 witnesses that were in the upper room, that were 500 when Jesus resurrected from the dead, and there were 3,000 that responded to the preaching of Peter on the day of Pentecost. Those people, one by one, like kernels of corn being popped, because you don't pop corn all at the same time, little by little, those people are popping, and they change the entire world. Those of you who have traveled abroad and you go into the Roman Colosseum that used Christians as nightlights for their chariot races, who fed the Christians to the lions, you walk into that Colosseum now, and when you look at the seat where Caesar sat, what's there now? A big old cross, an empty cross. Yeah, who has the last word now? He changed the world. One person at a time. Because each person, God can do exceeding abundant beyond all that we can think or imagine. That's why you have to have that grander vision. Church cannot just be about the lower room. Church has to be about the upper room. And that's where now we get trained. We work together. We confess our sins one to another. We support one another because this is the journey. Those of you who've been in conflict, you know how you depend upon your brothers so much. Well, we're fighting a spiritual battle. We need every single one of us to be present. Limitations have a way of creating all kinds of possibilities. Don't allow this COVID experience to dampen the perspective that you have regarding what God is going to do through his church. Because his church is going to reign. The only issue is, are we going to be a part of that? And he who has ears to hear, let him hear. So let me end with this video that I showed you, because he went on to show a little bit about his creativity. And the only reason why I'm showing this is because it's so astounding that I think if a guy could do this with his own art, tell me what the church of God can do if their hearts are on fire for his will.
And I was in a dark place for a long time, unable to create. And it didn't make any sense because I was finally able to support my art, and yet I was creatively blank. But as I searched around in the darkness, I realized I was actually paralyzed by all of the choices that I never had before. And it was then that I thought back to my jittery hands, embraced the shake. And I realized if I ever wanted my creativity back, I had to quit trying so hard to think outside of the box and get back into it. I wondered, could you become more creative then by looking for limitations? What if I could only create with $1's worth of supplies? At this point, I was spending a lot of my evenings well, I guess I still spend a lot of my evenings in Starbucks, but I know you can ask for an extra cup if you want one. So I decided to ask for 50. Surprisingly, they just handed them right over, and then with some pencils I already had, I made this project for only 80 cents. It really became a moment of clarification for me that we need to first be limited in order to become limitless. I took this approach of thinking inside the box to my canvas and wondered, what if instead of painting on a canvas, I could only paint on my chest? So I painted 30 images, one layer at a time, one on top of another, with each picture representing an influence in my life. Or what if instead of painting with a brush, I could only paint with karate chops? So I dipped my hands in paint, and I just attacked the canvas, and I actually hit so hard that I bruised a joint in my pinky, and it was stuck straight for a couple weeks. Or what if instead of relying on myself, I had to rely on other people to create the content for the art? So for 6 days, I lived in front of a webcam, I slept on the floor, and I ate takeout. And I asked people to call me and share a story with me about a life-changing moment. Their stories became the art as I wrote them onto the revolving canvas.
So he writes all those stories. The thickness of the letter, all of a sudden it turns into this piece of art. It's astounding, right? Is it any less astounding when we put on this gospel that Jesus gave us? And Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Some people want to put on that yoke, and they're like, yeah, no thanks. Or they start with this yoke, and it becomes so heavy because they have their eyes set on other things. But to those who put on the yoke of Jesus, he says, I make something out of nothing. That we're going to be engaged in a work that will span way beyond our lifetime. And we could be affecting people's eternity. That's why yesterday was such a great, the day before, right, when we looked at that video of how people were sharing this story. And everybody got a little emotional because we recognized that that was us, right? Somebody shared with me and somebody had shared with them. And your whole eternity has been changed because of it. See, the path from here to eternity is marked by vision, the power of the Word, the validity of the unity of the body, the tenacity in which we just grow, and ultimately that we keep the main thing, the grand vision of fulfilling His will and purposes until He comes. As one guy said, I will not let up, look back, slow down, back away, or be still. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of my adversary, negotiate at the table of my enemy, or ponder in a pool of mediocrity. God bless you. Thank you so much.